This is a clip from one of our recent live streams. We stream live every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. As a reminder, this is our second channel, Fish the Moment Live. Our main channel, Fish the Moment, is where we have all of our highly edited YouTube content. We spend 30 to 40 hours a week producing one YouTube video that's posted on the Fish the Moment channel every Thursday at 7 a.m. Central Standard Time. These videos include on-the-water footage of us actually fishing, as well as detailed instruction on how to use electronics, fish offshore, and a lot of other great information. Make sure to check out the Fish the Moment channel if you enjoy the content on this channel. The third mistake I see guys make when they're fishing swim baits is that they're not fishing them for the right bass. What I mean by that is that they're either trying to fish them for bass that are on the bottom when they're should be fishing them for bass that are suspended, or vice versa. And really, what I find is that when I'm fishing offshore, I'm almost exclusively fishing for suspended bass with my swim baits, where Randy, he spends a lot of his time fishing for bass that are on the bottom with his swim baits when he's fishing in shallower water. So you have to make sure that you adjust the type of fish you're fishing for based on what type of swim bait fishing you're doing. So let me kind of explain with a graphic here, and hopefully this will all make sense. So I'll just pull up a nice little graphic. You guys know I love my graphics. So got this pulled up here, and basically what we have is we have a largemouth bass, we have some cover, and we have some bait fish. And I'm going to kind of explain a little bit, Randy, your shallow water stuff too with these graphics just while I have it, and then I'll also let you kind of go into it as well. But whenever I'm trying to fish for offshore fish and I'm trying to fish a swim bait, I'm usually targeting bass that are off the bottom and are feeding on bait fish. They're usually anywhere from 3 to maybe 10 feet off the bottom, but maybe not right on the surface. They're kind of in the middle of the water column. And these bass are usually really tricky to catch with your traditional baits like a jig or a crankbait or spinnerbait. But swim baits are a great tool for getting these fish to bite. And basically what I'm doing is I'm casting my swim bait down, I'm letting it sink down to a depth that's maybe 2 to 3 feet above the level of where I think the bass are. And I'm going to swim that swim bait right over the top of those fish. And whenever you can get a swim bait to come over the top of a bass's head in, let's say, 2 to 3 feet from that fish, you're almost always going to get those fish to bite if they're in a feeding mood. Now, one mistake I see a lot of guys make is that they'll actually fish their swim baits either too deep, below the fish. And if you fish your swim bait below a bass, usually that bass is not going to go eat it because bass feed upwards. Their eyes are kind of more on the top of their head, so they're going to be feeding up a lot of the time when they are feeding in the middle of the water column suspended. So you want a bait that's going to go above their head, or you want to make sure that bait is at least level with them in front of that fish's face. Now you may be wondering, what type of area should I be looking for? So let me kind of just give you a quick example. I'm actually going to pull up some sonar recordings here of some fish that I catch on swim baits, just to kind of give you a better understanding of what I'm looking for. So got a recording pulled up right here. Just give me 1 second while I get this going. So here is an example, if I transition my screen, right here, of some fish that are suspended off the bottom, 3 to 5 feet off the bottom, some of them maybe 10 to 15 feet off the bottom. And you can see these fish on the down imaging. I identify a lot of my swim bait fish with down imaging. And so what I'll do is see several fish suspended over the top of rocks or brush or whatever. And what I'll try to do is cast my swim bait out, count it down to about 10 feet or to about 2 to 3 feet above where I see most of the fish. So in this example, I see a lot of the fish in that 10 to maybe 15 foot range. So I'm going to try to count down my swim bait to about 10 feet. And I do this by counting, or I basically do this by dropping my swim bait in the water before I cast it, seeing how long it takes for the bait to fall 2 or 3 feet. And then if it falls, let's say, a foot a second, I'm going to count the bait down 10 seconds. And then I'm going to just start reeling it in. And I'm going to try to reel that bait straight over the top of those fish. Now, if you see fish in your graph, usually they'll be hanging out there for at least a little bit. And so it may take you a couple casts to determine how fast you need to reel that bait to keep that bait right at that 10 or 15 foot mark. But if you get it right, those fish are going to hammer it. Here's another example of another spot where I found some fish suspended over the top of a big boulder. And in this case, I actually just cast a swim bait in, let it sink for maybe 5 or 6 seconds just to get down 4 or 5 feet, and then reeled it right over the top of those fish's heads. They came up out of 10 foot of water and crushed it. So this is how I catch a lot of fish. Now, I did see a question, what about 70-foot suspended bass on table rock? Well, on Table Rock, a lot of those fish are actually going to suspend in trees and standing timber, kind of like what you'll see here in this brush pile, except for just imagine this is 70 feet of water. The same thing applies. I'm basically just going to, let's assume that this tree is in 70 feet of water. I'm going to look for the bass with my down imaging, find them on the graph, count my bait down to 70 feet, and then reel it through them. Now, in that situation, a lot of times it's actually easier to catch those fish fishing vertically with a jigging spoon or with like an ice fishing jig, just because getting a bait down to 70 feet and keeping it down there is really, really hard unless you throw a really heavy jig head. So I prefer to get vertical on those fish when they're super, super deep. I usually prefer to throw a swim bait when those fish are in less than 30 feet of water suspended. But this is the type of stuff I'm looking for when I'm fishing a swim bait. And a lot of guys are not fishing a swim bait in these conditions. They might try to throw a swim bait when the bass are positioned on the bottom, or when they're maybe not seeing this exact image on the screen. And this is something I see a lot happening. Guys try to go fish swim baits when the bass are literally on the bottom of the lake. And they might try to grind that swim bait on the rocks or whatever. And that works with some fisheries, maybe on the Tennessee River with ledge fishing. You can catch fish on a scrounger head and a hollow body swim bait fishing it on the bottom. But usually you can catch those same fish with a football jig, a Carolina rig, a deep diving crankbait. So for me, I'll choose those baits over a swim bait most of the time. The only reason those guys are really throwing swim baits on those Tennessee River areas is because those fish are so conditioned to every other bait that gets thrown at them that the swim bait just gives them something different to throw at those fish, and that's why they're doing it. But when I'm fishing on my lakes where the fish aren't heavily pressured, I can throw a crankbait for the fish that are on the bottom, but when those fish are suspended, that's when the swim bait becomes the ultimate tool. So again, let that bait sink down, work it through those fish above and the top of their heads, and you're going to get a ton of fish on the swim bait. Now again, you might have to go to a bigger swim bait with different head sizes and things like that, and you also have to figure out the fall rate of that bait to keep it in the strike zone. But once you get it dialed in, which might take a few fishing trips, maybe even a lot of fishing trips, it is an absolutely deadly technique, and I have caught literally hundreds and hundreds of bass doing this, Randy, over the years, maybe even 1,000 bass on swim baits. It took me a long time to really get it dialed in and figured out, but once I got it dialed in and I was able to target those suspended fish, it was lights out. And now they have the live scope, it's even easier because now you can actually see the fish moving in real time, actually watch your swim bait. So it's made fishing that way so much easier. But I've been doing it without the live scope for 6-7 years now, no problem. Here's a quick reminder of some of the upcoming seminars we're offering on fishthemoment.com. These seminars are 3 hours long and are packed with graphics and highly detailed information about specific fishing techniques and bass behavior. Also check out our seasonal lake breakdowns, where we offer 40 GPS waypoints on lakes all across the country by season. All this is available at fishthemoment.com.
Yeah, it's sort of the deal on the way that I fish them. I'm fishing, like I said, for a completely different personality of bass. It's almost like it's a completely different species of bass, because the bass that I'm targeting in the wintertime around and anywhere I go when I'm fishing shallow, they're lone, isolated, rogue bass for the most part. Johnny's fishing for school fish. He's fishing for groups of bass that are, setting up on offshore structure. But mine are just individual rogue fish. Once in a while, I might catch two fish off the same point, but for the most part, it's one here and one there. So when you approach it from that manner, the way that you have to look at it's different. I know right off the bat, if you guys had come in the boat with me right now, if we go down to Table Rock Lake tomorrow, Bull Shoals or whatever around here, we'd be the only ones on the bank. Nobody is fishing the bank around here since live scope came up. Literally everybody's off the bank. So I've got all the bank to myself right now, still catching a lot of fish off the bank. So what I'm looking for with that is I'm not necessarily focused on the bass being set up in one different depth zone, because some days, depending upon the wind or lack of wind, depending upon the light penetration in the water, depending upon the angle, maybe if I'm fishing secondary or main lake points, the slope of that bank, there's a lot of different ways these bass are going to position, and they're going to react differently to the swim bait, because some days they want a swim bait, some days they want a jerk bait, some days they want a crankbait in that water depth that's less than 10 feet deep.
Hey, Randy, while we're talking about this, would you mind pulling up Google Earth just to kind of show us some of those banks that you're fishing?
Okay, I'll give you guys an example of the difference between like the way that I'm fishing right now versus the way that Johnny's fishing. This is a point on Table Rock here where I actually have been catching some fish off of the last couple of weeks. Now, this particular point right here, this is a pea gravel type flat point. It's got a long taper out that gradually drops off on both sides. So you may have 30 to 40 foot of water here, just a slow taper off over there. Every one of these points, if you're fishing a man-made reservoir that has water visibility of like over 2.5 or 3 feet, every single secondary main lake point is going to have two groups of fish on these points. You're going to have a group of fish that are in this 5 to 10 foot zone that are living on the bottom there. And you're going to have a group of fish that are out deeper off the ends and the sides of these points that are suspended, like what Johnny's talking about. I'm not fishing for these fish out here. These are the live scoper guys out here. I'm on the bank right here fishing. So on this particular thing, this is all about my 3-inch spark shad, 6-pound test line, 1/8 ounce Okashira jig head, regardless of the situation. You will find when it comes to swim bait fishing in the wintertime that the bass will position totally according to the wind direction unless it's completely calm. Say, for example, if the wind's coming in this direction, towards the bank, this is going to be the sweet spot here. If the wind's coming straight in like that, you're going to have a sweet spot here. If it's coming in like this, the bass are going to be over here. And that's just the rest of the point for me anyway is pretty much dead. If I have like a 10-mile-an-hour wind hitting the point right here, I'm going to catch my fish right here, 5 to 10 feet of water, and I'm going to go around this point here and probably not get another bite. Now, if it's calm out, it's completely different. Those fish will scatter and they'll use every part of the point there. But like I said, what I'm targeting here are these fish that are coming up off the bottom. These are actually fish that are probably feeding on crawdads, and they're just opportunistic. I'm throwing that swim bait out there, crawling it just a few inches off the bottom, and they're hitting it just like they would a crankbait or a jig or some type of a bottom bouncing lure. Once in a while, if I get out and say into that 10 to 15 foot zone a little bit deeper, you may have an occasional little small wolf pack that are suspended like 5 or 10 feet down, over that 10 to 15 foot of water. That's a possibility. So anyway, like I said, this is what I'm looking for. Nobody around this part of the country where I'm fishing, nobody's fishing these fish right here. Everybody's out here. They're graphing in the middle of these guts out here, way out off the point ends. So, there's more than one way to catch them with that. But for me, the thing that I found out more than anything else, it's not necessarily about the point slope or the rock, the mixture of rock on it. It's just about having that secondary or main point that's leading into some type of a creek channel where you got, maybe some coves. These fish are just staging, getting ready to move back into these creeks to spawn in another couple months.
Oh, cool. I got you. Sorry, I was muted, so I was typing. I wouldn't be messing it up. So this is an example here, guys, on Navionics. I just pulled up a Navionics map here, Randy, of a very similar area. It may be the exact point. I'm not sure. And this is the type of point. Yeah, no worries. But yeah, Randy is talking about a point that looks like this. It's a gradual sloping point. You can see the contour lines are pretty spread apart, and then they tighten up a little bit as you get off the point. And this is kind of surprising, I think, to a lot of guys. And it was surprising to me, Randy, when you explained what points you fished up shallow, because a lot of guys are going to think about fishing these sharp drop-off banks, these channel swing banks where you have the water going from shallow water to deeper water very quickly. This would be like a bluff wall, a 45-degree rocky bank. Not as many guys are going to be going onto these flat points, but this is what Randy's targeting, both with jerkbaits and with swim baits. And a lot of the fish that I catch are actually, like Randy was talking about, in the middle of these guts or maybe way off the tip of these points out here. And I'm looking in 20 or 30 feet of water on a brush pile or a rock pile. But there's another group of fish that live super shallow. And basically what Randy is doing is he is targeting the fish that are on the bottom. So the fish that I'm focused on, again, are way out here suspended. Randy's targeting fish on the bottom, reeling that swim bait almost like a crankbait down on the bottom of the lake, and then sometimes fishing it just a few feet off the bottom. Completely different way of fishing a swim bait, and that's why he goes to the lighter heads, because if you fish too heavy of a head, he's just going to get hung up on the bottom all day long. But for me, I'm fishing so much deeper, I need the heavier head to trigger those bites. So does that kind of wrap it up pretty well, Randy?
Yeah, it's like I said, there's a lot of times that when you're talking about swim bait fishing in and around secondary points, and this is the primary winter setup for most man-made lakes. I'm going to guess that at least half of the key winter areas center around secondary main points.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get too locked up on the rock composition or the angle of the point. Bass will relate to a lot of different type of points under a variety of conditions. To me, it's more about how the wind's hitting that point, and what the adjacent setup of that point is in relationship to like a creek or the main lake in there.
For sure. I think a lot of guys don't realize how shallow the fish will get in the wintertime. One thing that you were talking about earlier, Randy, that I wanted to bring back up and I had forgot is you were talking about with your swim bait fishing that you will go to a shallow stretch of water and catch them in 50-degree water on a swim bait up super shallow. So I pulled up Google Earth here, and basically here's an example of an area I've caught them on like that on Lake Washita. If you take a look right here, you can see there's a little bit of a color change where it goes from darker to lighter. This is actually a grass line. Now I've caught fish on Lake Washita in 50-degree water temperatures when it's raining and sleeting and ice coming down on a lipless crankbait as well as on a swim bait up in 2 or 3 feet of water out of shallow grass in the middle of the winter time. If you have grass in your lake, those fish will get really shallow and you can catch them up in pretty cold water temperature, very, very shallow throughout the entire winter. You can also do this on rocky banks as well. It doesn't need to necessarily just be grassy lakes. And a lot of times I find that if you can fish really shallow in the winter with a lipless crankbait, a swim bait, stuff like that, you have a lot better chance of catching a big fish versus the guys fishing offshore. When I fish offshore, I catch a lot of numbers when those fish are schooled up, and it's really the only time I catch big fish is if I find like a brush pile deal or something like that. But if I want to win tournaments, especially in like central Arkansas where I grew up, unless you find a brush pile deal or some fish in standing timber like randomly, the best way to catch them is throwing a lipless crankbait down the bank all day long and hoping to get 5 bites, even when the water temperature is 48 degrees. And you're grinding that lipless crankbait in 2 foot of water all day and catching them off the same banks we showed earlier there on Table Rock.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Thanks for checking out the video. If you made it this far, we'd really appreciate if you left a like on the video. It helps us out with the YouTube algorithm and gets these videos out to more people. Also consider subscribing. It's free and it lets you get notifications of every single one of our videos that we upload daily. Finally, remember to check out the main Fish the Moment channel, where we actually have on-the-water fishing footage as well as detailed graphics on electronics, offshore fishing, bass behavior, and a lot of other great information. Thanks for checking out the video, and we'll see you all in the next one.